Hello everyone, tonight we're stepping straight into the cold, into a world where survival meant turning yourself into someone else's blanket. From sleeping nose tuners with a goat, to rubbing animal fat on your skin so you didn't freeze solid, to lying awake listening for wolves scratching at the edge of the firelight. This was how people made it through winters that would have killed the rest of us in a single night. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this strange little corner of history where comfort didn't exist and survival was a group project. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel compared to the tribes who couldn't. So dim your lights, pull a blanket a little tighter, maybe let a kettle simmer in the background. Let's sink into the silence, the fire, and the shared bodies that kept our ancestors alive. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine this. Instead of waking up in a heated apartment with a thermostat you don't even understand, you were born into a hut so cold that your first lullaby was the sound of teeth chattering. Forget baby showers with pastel decorations. Your welcome into the world came with animal fat rubbed into your skin so you wouldn't freeze solid before your first feed. Congratulations, you're a newborn human popsicle. From the moment you squeal, survival is a group project. Your mother bundles you in fur's reindeer, seal, bison, whatever didn't run fast enough last season. Moss or feathers get tucked between the layers, not because it's cozy, but because it's the only insulation available when winter temperatures dip low enough to make your breath freeze in your nose hairs. Yes, even baby nose hairs. Cute, but deadly. Infants like you were liabilities. Everyone knew it. You couldn't walk, haul wood, or keep a fire alive. You couldn't even hold your head up, let alone your own body heat. So the tribe poured resources into you, skin's fat, precious calories, gambling that you'd live long enough to eventually carry water or scrape hides. Your value was future labor, not cuteness. Although, to be fair, big round eyes probably didn't hurt. Winter wasn't just a season, it was the season. The cold dictated everything: birth rates, mortality, food supply, even what kind of stories people told by firelight. Archaeologists can see the pattern in bones: children buried in small furs, elders lost when resources ran thin. Your birth in the deep freeze was both miracle and risk, written into the archaeological record as a population bottleneck that every generation had to push through. And when I say cold, don't picture the kind of brisk chill where you buy a pumpkin latte and complain. I'm talking about Siberian nights where the temperature dives to -40 degrees Celsius, or northern winters where daylight shrinks to a few faint hours. Cold so absolute that fire wasn't optional, it was religion. Without it, your tiny body would shut down before you even got to teething. So, from day one, you were wrapped, swaddled, and pressed against other bodies. Mothers carried babies in skin pouches, tucked beneath their own clothes, sharing warmth directly. Breast milk wasn't just nutrition, it was central heating in liquid form. Crying too loudly at night, dangerous sound carried in the frozen air, and predators, wolves, lynx, or just hungry humans from another camp could hear you. Silence, like heat, was survival. It's hard to overstate how much energy went into keeping you alive those first winters. Fires had to be maintained constantly, fat rendered, skins dried, moss collected, smoke vented. You weren't born into a family, you were born into a logistical operation. And while you lay bundled in your fur cocoon, half asleep and probably covered in soot, the unspoken rule was clear: don't waste heat, don't waste breath, don't waste food. That's the person you could have been, not the master of your climate, but its hostage. From your first whimper, the cold made the rules. And if you survived infancy, it wasn't because you were strong, it was because everyone else in that cramped shelter decided you were worth the calories. But you wouldn't get to coast for long. Sooner than you'd like, you'd be expected to give something back by stomping mud, hauling wood, or, more importantly, helping build the very architecture that kept bodies from freezing in the dark. If you'd made it past those first bone-cracking winters swaddled in moss and fat, you'd quickly learn that survival wasn't just about bodies, it was about walls. Not the fancy kind with drywall and double glazing, but shelters built to trick winter into leaving you alone. The architecture of your world was less about beauty and more about not becoming an ice sculpture. Your home wasn't some airy villa. It was deliberately small, low, and suffocating, because every extra cubic meter meant heat wasted into thin air. Picture crouching into an earthen pit dug into the ground, roofed with logs and hides, sealed with sod and snow. The deeper you went, the warmer it stayed. Think of it as the original basement apartment, except everyone shared it, smelled like smoke, and no one was paying rent. Entrances were designed like airlocks, narrow tunnels sloping downward, so cold air couldn't just barge in. You'd crawl through bent double, dragging in snow on your boots, before emerging into the main space where the fire smoked up through a hole in the roof. Not much light, almost no ventilation, and a constant risk of carbon monoxide. But hey, at least you weren't freezing to death. Yet, archaeologists have dug up these shelters across the Arctic and subarctic, from Siberia to Canada, and the pattern is the same. Low ceilings, thick insulation, pits for storing food, and hearths that never went cold. Even mammoth bones were pressed into service on the Eurasian steppe, stacked into frameworks and covered with hides. Imagine sleeping under a ceiling of tusks, grotesque but effective, like interior design by extinction. Inside, space was arranged for maximum survival. Families clustered closest to the fire, elders tucked into corners where drafts were weakest. Animals sometimes tethered inside to add body heat. If the idea of sleeping 3 feet from a reindeer sounds unglamorous, you're right. But better a smelly companion than a frozen corpse. And dung, not wasted, dried. It became fuel-proof that nothing in this economy of cold went unused. The walls themselves told a story of compromise. Snow could be a curse outside, but pressed into blocks, it became insulation. Grass sod, stitched hides, woven reeds all layered, patched, and repatched. Your roof wasn't something you admired. It was something you prayed didn't collapse under the weight of a snowstorm at 3 a.m. If it did, congratulations, you'd be entombed before your time, and someone would carve a new shelter right on top of the rubble. And don't think you got privacy. These shelters were crammed. 10, 15, sometimes 20 bodies in one smoky chamber, breathing the same air, coughing into the same dark. Privacy was a modern invention. Here, survival meant tolerating every snore, fart, and whispered story told by firelight. It also meant sharing every illness. If one kid caught a cough, everyone else got an invitation. The house was warm, yes, but it was also a petri dish with mammoth bone decor. Still, it worked. These architectural tricks, earth insulation, communal spaces, narrow entrances, let tribes endure winters that would otherwise have wiped them off the map. Your survival was literally carved into soil, bone, and hide. And as you grew older, you'd be handed your share of responsibility, cutting wood, patching roofs, or standing guard by the fire. Because walls alone didn't save you. The real heart of this architecture, the one thing you couldn't afford to let fail, was fire itself. So now you're inside that smoky pit of survival, walls sealed with sod, roof sagging under snow. 20 people and a reindeer pressed together in what feels like a prehistoric sleepover gone wrong. But the real center of it all isn't the people, it's the fire. Without it, you're not a community. You're just corpses waiting to be catalogued by archaeologists. Fire was the sun dragged indoors, the one thing nobody dared let die, because if it went out in midwinter, so did you. Every day revolved around that glow. The hearth wasn't furniture, was religion, economics, medicine, and gossip circle all in one. Your tribe didn't own land or gold, it owned fire. That meant someone always had the job of firekeeper, a rotating role that was equal parts sacred and miserable. Imagine staying awake through the night in -30°C, feeding twigs into embers while everyone else snored on top of each other. If your eyelids drooped and the fire went dark, congratulations, you'd just become history's least popular roommate. And fire wasn't just warmth, it was food. Without it, meat stayed raw, parasites stayed alive, and your stomach stayed empty. Archaeological hearths littered with bones and charred seeds tell us people weren't just roasting meat, they were boiling stews, smoking fish, roasting nuts, and extracting marrow from bones, calorie by calorie, to keep warm from the inside out. Winter wasn't about feasting, it was about engineering every ounce of fat into survival fuel. Of course, fire came with its own problems. Smoke. Endless, eye-watering smoke. Those holes cut into roofs. They barely vented anything. Your lungs became chimneys, your eyes stung constantly, and the walls turned black. Anthropologists studying bone samples find evidence of lung damage from a lifetime of breathing indoor smoke. So while fire kept you alive, it also slowly killed you, a paradox no one could escape. And yet, nobody dared complain. Better coughing than freezing. Fire also meant danger. Sparks jumped, huts caught flame, and sometimes entire shelters went up in minutes. In Arctic folklore, fire spirits were treated with the same fear as winter storms. You respected flame, fed it carefully, whispered thanks to it, because everyone knew the same fire that gave you life could take everything in one careless moment. But even with smoke, burns, and risk, fire remained the closest thing to magic you knew. It was where people gathered, told stories, sang softly, and passed on knowledge. Every myth about gods, ancestors, or animals was warmed by firelight. Every winter memory smelled faintly of smoke and charred fat. Your sense of community wasn't built in meetings or schools. It was built in the glow of embers, faces flickering red and gold. So yes, you were born into cold, wrapped in hides, housed in sod and bone. But without fire, all of that was meaningless. It was the one thing you couldn't afford to lose, the fragile line between humanity and the endless dark. And because fire was fragile, silence became its twin, because too much noise wasted breath, invited danger, and reminded everyone how thin the walls between survival and collapse really were. Now picture the night. The fire's glow has shrunk to embers. 20 bodies are tangled together like some strange human knot, and outside, the world is frozen into stillness. This is the kind of silence modern ears can't even imagine. No hum of electricity, no distant cars, not even the annoying bark of a neighbor's dog, just cold pressing in from every direction, and the occasional pop of wood in the hearth. Silence wasn't optional, it was survival. In winter, every breath mattered, every spark of energy had to be conserved. Talking too much wasted heat, wasted effort, so people didn't fill the nights with chatter. They whispered, if they spoke at all. Words were rationed like food. It wasn't that they had nothing to say, it was that the air was too heavy with frost to waste it on unnecessary noise. And besides, sound carried far in that kind of cold. Too far. If you shouted, your voice could echo across the snowfields, announcing to predators exactly where a huddle of warm, edible humans was hiding. Wolves, lynx, and occasionally less friendly humans all had ears tuned to the silence. Which means your best defense wasn't a weapon, it was quiet. Babies were hushed, children trained early to stifle cries. A loud cough could bring down the collective wrath of a tribe terrified of being noticed. Silence shaped the way people thought. Stories weren't declaimed in booming voices, but murmured around the fire. Half-whispered myths about spirits, ancestors, and the shape of the world. Singing existed, but it was soft, low, almost more vibration than sound. Think lullabies for grown adults who needed to forget, for just a moment, that death might be sleeping at the door. And then there was the silence inside you, the silence of hunger gnawing your belly when the hunt failed. The silence of breath frosting in the air while you waited for dawn. The silence of watching snow pile up against the roof and wondering if spring would come before your firewood ran out. People didn't need meditation apps to teach them mindfulness. They lived it. Stillness was forced on them by nature. The quiet wasn't calming, it was heavy, almost suffocating, like the whole world holding its breath. Anthropologists studying these communities describe winter as a time of restricted speech, not because people didn't want to talk, but because they knew too much sound could cost lives. In Inuit oral traditions, even humor so abundant in daily life was muted during long nights, reserved for safe moments when laughter wouldn't carry. Imagine giggling too loud at a bad joke, and realizing you'd just invited a pack of wolves to dinner. Suddenly not funny. Of course, silence had its own kind of intimacy. Lying pressed against your family, hearing only their breath, and the faint crackle of fire, you learned to read emotions without words. A sigh meant exhaustion, a shift in the body pile meant discomfort, a pause in breathing meant fear. Silence taught a language that modern people have mostly forgotten. Listening not with ears, but with skin, with shared warmth. So yes, your nights were quiet, sometimes beautifully so, sometimes terrifyingly so. And in that stillness, pressed against kin, you learned that silence wasn't emptiness. It was structure, discipline, and shield. It kept the world out and your heat in. And just as silence held you together, so too did the other bodies in that shelter. Because survival wasn't just shared walls or shared fire. It was shared flesh, pressed close enough to blur where one person ended and another began. By now, you're used to sleeping in silence, pressed against family, half choking on smoke, half dreaming of spring. But here's the detail no one tells in the romance of communal living. It wasn't just people piled into those huts. Animals slept there too. Not the cute kind you keep in an apartment for Instagram photos, no. These were working, sweating, farting, companions whose body heat was worth more than your opinion about the smell. Dogs were the first and most loyal roommates. Archaeology shows they weren't just hunting partners, but living blankets, curled at the feet of sleepers or pressed against children to keep them warm. You'd grow up with a dog, not as a pet, but as part of the heating system. You loved it, sure, but you also needed it. That distinction matters when -30 degrees Celsius is gnawing at your bones. And it wasn't just dogs. Reindeer among circumpolar groups, goats and sheep further south. Sometimes even calves animals were brought inside during the harshest winters. Think of it less like a barn and more like a low-ceilinged zoo exhibit, where you were also on display, trying not to freeze. The logic was simple. One reindeer body throws off heat like a small radiator. 2 or 3, and you might just survive the night. The downside, you'd wake up to steaming dung by the fire. But even that wasn't wasted dried. It became extra fuel. That's efficiency, ancient style. Of course, this meant sleep was never peaceful. Imagine trying to drift off while a goat gnawed at your straw bedding. A dog twitched in a dream beside you, and someone's baby whimpered in the corner. The hut was alive in every sense breath, heat, noise, and smell blending into a single stew of survival. You didn't get clean air, you got warm air, and that was the only kind that mattered. Animals weren't just tolerated, they were sacred. Many mythologies of the far north and steppe revolve around them, because people quite literally owed their lives to beasts sharing their beds. Dogs were guides to the afterlife, reindeer were seen as bridges between worlds, and cattle as tokens of prosperity. Sleeping beside them wasn't simply practical, it was spiritual intimacy. A nightly reminder that humans weren't separate from animals, but tangled up in the same fragile bargain with winter. And yet, you didn't romanticize it. You joked, you cursed, you learned to step carefully in the dark. Children grew up half playing, half working with dogs and goats, learning early that survival didn't mean choosing what was pleasant, it meant using what was present. Archaeologists find traces of fur embedded in soil floors, bones discarded near hearths, proof that the line between human and animal homes blurred almost completely. So, in that pit of bodies and smoke, you weren't just part of a family, you were part of a menagerie. Human warmth wasn't enough, and fire wasn't enough. You needed paws, hooves, and fur. You needed the smell, the mess, the shared heat. It wasn't pretty, but it was survival. And if you thought lying shoulder to shoulder with a goat was the peak of indignity, just wait until you realize that your own body was being conscripted into service not for labor in the day, but for warmth at night. If you thought survival was just about huts and hearths, think again. In winter, your body wasn't just yours, it was a piece of the collective heating system. Privacy, a myth, personal space, extinct. You slept, pressed into others until you couldn't tell if the warmth on your back came from your brother, your grandmother, or a goat. The concept of my body didn't exist. It was always our bodies, stitched together under layers of hide, all sweating, breathing, and steaming into the same air. Children, of course, were stuffed in the middle, not out of sentiment, but out of practicality. A child on the edge was a child who froze. So you, as the little one, spent winters cocooned between adults, your face mashed into someone's shoulder, your legs tangled in fur, your breath sinking to the rhythm of the group. Babies were tucked inside, skin slings under their mother's clothing, nursing as insulation as much as for nutrition. Motherhood wasn't soft, it was central heating with a pulse. And the thing is, the arrangement wasn't negotiable. You didn't get to pout and say, "I need my own bed." Your bed was the tribe, and the tribe was the blanket. If someone shifted in the middle of the night, everyone shifted. If someone coughed, everyone inhaled the same cough. It was messy, sweaty, and sometimes suffocating, but it worked. When the temperature outside dipped to the kind of cold that could freeze spilled water midair, you stayed alive not because you were comfortable, but because you were inconveniently close to half your kin. Anthropologists call this thermal pooling, a sterile phrase for what was, in reality, human survival at its most intimate. Body heat, skin to skin, wrapped in furs. Even adults paired off, not necessarily for romance but for warmth. Marriage, in winter, was less about companionship and more about being allowed to share someone else's body heat without asking. And if your marriage was unhappy, too bad, you still pressed together at night, teeth chattering, until both of you forgot why you were angry. And no, this wasn't just a northern thing. Across cultures, Arctic, Siberian, Alpine, Europe, the principle is the same. Humans are radiators with legs, and winter is an endless power outage. To survive, you stack the radiators together, no matter the smell, the noise, or the occasional argument about who hogged the best spot near the fire. But survival had rules. Elders sometimes gave up warm spots to children, moving to the edges, their thin bodies cooling first. Death was often quiet, almost unnoticed, in these piles of warmth. A body stilled in the night, and by dawn, someone was cold, not because the fire went out, but because one human furnace had finally stopped burning. It was tragic, yes, but also practical. Heat had to be conserved for those who could still carry it forward. So your body, in that winter hut, was never just yours. It was shared property, a small flame among many, pressed together into something stronger than any single spark. You slept not as an individual but as part of a living engine of warmth, one that didn't stop for embarrassment or discomfort. And when dawn came, groggy and half-frozen, you didn't stretch luxuriously in a private bed. You untangled yourself from the tribe's embrace and stepped into the next task. Clothing, which wasn't fashion, but bedding you dragged into daylight to keep yourself from freezing all over again. Now that you've accepted your body as communal property, let's talk about what you're wearing, or, more accurately, what you're never taking off. In a freezing winter camp, clothing wasn't about looking good. It was about not being found stiff as a board in the morning. Fashion Week didn't exist. Survival Week did, and the runway was lined with reindeer hide, seal gut, bird skins, moss, and whatever else could be stitched together without falling apart in the middle of the night. Forget pajamas. You slept in the same clothes you wore during the day, because stripping down was an invitation to hypothermia. That tunic of hide stiff with sweat and smoke. Congratulations, it's also your blanket. The boots patched with sinew, lined with moss that smelled faintly of swamp. They stay on too, unless you enjoy frostbite nibbling at your toes while you dream. Clothes weren't changed. They were layered, repaired, and eventually replaced when they rotted off your body. Layers were key. Archaeological finds show garments lined with fur turned inward, outer layers coated with grease or fish oil to block wind. Bird skins were sometimes stitched together, feathers facing in, creating down jackets long before Patagonia claimed the idea. And moss was stuffed into boots, pants, and cloaks. Absorbent, insulating, and available in bulk. It was nature's thermal underwear. When damp, you just swapped it out, like replacing socks you didn't technically have. Your bedding wasn't separate from your clothes. Blankets were rare luxuries, and even furs were communal, spread across bodies in layers. At night, your clothing and the tribe's clothing blurred into one enormous quilt of stitched hides and sweat. By morning, it smelled like smoke, fat, and unwashed humanity, an aroma so distinctive archaeologists can still detect traces of animal oils on ancient textiles. Oh, day survival, let's call it. And here's the catch. Moisture was your enemy. Wet clothes killed faster than hunger. If snow melted on your skin, if sweat froze against your back, if boots soaked through, you didn't just feel uncomfortably, you risked death. That's why animal fat was rubbed onto hides, and even skin, creating a greasy, protective layer against damp and wind. Imagine falling asleep smelling like a mixture of wet dog and fish market. Charming, yes, but effective. Even ceremonial dress was adapted to survival. Yes, you might decorate a parka with beads or carve patterns into bone toggles, but the point was still insulation. The beauty was in the function. What kept you warm kept you alive. Strip away the modern romanticism of fur hoods framed in frost, and what you really see is an ancient blanket masquerading as a jacket, meant to be slept in, sweated in, and worn until it fell apart. So you didn't have closets. You didn't have outfits. You had layers that clung to you day and night, turning your body into a walking bedroll. And when you lay down by the fire, pressed against your kin, you weren't slipping under sheets. You were collapsing into the same smoked, fur-lined cocoon you'd worn since autumn. Which brings us to another reality of winter survival. Even the best clothes and bedding couldn't keep you warm if your stomach was empty. And in these camps, what you ate before sleep could decide whether you woke up in the morning or didn't. By now, you're wrapped in layers of fur and grease, pressed against kin, with a goat snoring somewhere behind you. But warmth alone won't carry you through the night. Sleep, in a frozen world, depended on what you ate. And if you didn't eat enough fat before lying down, you weren't just going to bed hungry. You were gambling with your core temperature. Winter diets revolved around fat, not because ancient people were gourmets of marrow and blubber, but because fat burns slow. Seal oil, bear grease, reindeer marrow, pine nuts, stored fish. Each calorie was a candle in the body, releasing heat through the long silence of the night. A belly full of fat-rich stew meant you might drift off and wake up alive. Go to bed on an empty stomach, though, and your own metabolism might abandon you before dawn. Archaeologists find cracked bones at winter sites, split to suck out marrow, evidence that nothing was wasted. Fish were smoked, meat dried, nuts hoarded like gold. Even in the deep cold, caches were hidden under snow, sometimes guarded with stones or charms to keep desperate scavengers, human or animal, away. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to make sure your body stayed a furnace until the sun returned, and timing mattered. Meals before sleep were deliberate. You didn't just have dinner, you stoked your body like a fire, giving it fuel to last the hours ahead. Think of it as pre-industrial midnight snacking, except your choice was between a slab of smoked reindeer fat or nothing at all. Archaeological residues show lipid traces in pottery stews, thick with animal oils, shared communally, eaten with fingers or carved spoons, then followed by silence. But hunger was always waiting. Winters of failed hunts or spoiled stores were catastrophic. Oral traditions speak of hungry winters where sleep became restless, shallow, haunted by the gnawing of empty bellies. Modern physiology backs it up. Starvation makes sleep nearly impossible. Your body, craving energy, jolts you awake, making the night endless, cruel, and noisy with stomachs growling in unison. Children were prioritized, fed the last bits of marrow or fish oil, tucked into the warmest places at night. Elders gave up rations, sometimes voluntarily, knowing food stretched further if they ate less. In archaeological graves, older bones often show signs of malnutrition, thin, brittle, worn down by repeated sacrifices. Their hunger gave the young a better chance to wake up to spring. Even drink played a role. Broths and warm liquids circulated before bed, not for taste but for heat. The heat of the liquid itself mattered as much as the calories inside it. Every sip was a brief spark against the cold. Imagine sipping hot marrow broth in a smoky hut, then curling up to sleep with the faint warmth still lingering in your chest. So your nightly rest wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about careful preparation, a fire tended, bodies pressed together, layers of fur pulled tight, and a stomach lined with fat to trick your body into burning slow. You slept, yes, but it was always a fragile bargain between fuel, heat, and darkness. And to make sure that bargain didn't collapse, someone had to stay awake while you slept. Someone had to watch the fire. Someone had to guard the night. So you've eaten your marrow stew, burrowed under hides, pressed against your relatives like logs in a fire, and drifted off into smoky half-sleep. Lucky you, but not everyone gets to close their eyes. While most of the camp snores, one unlucky soul is stuck upright by the hearth, poking embers and fighting off exhaustion. The night watch, the most thankless job in the tribe, second only to scraping frozen dung at dawn. The role rotated, but it was always the same: keep the fire alive. If flames died in the middle of a winter night, it wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Relighting fire wasn't like striking a match. It meant hours of sparks, tinder, patience, and prayers. So the watch sat hunched, feeding the embers carefully, sometimes blowing softly on them, sometimes tossing in twigs scavenged at the last moment. Each crackle of flame was a victory, each lull a potential catastrophe. But fire wasn't the only reason someone stayed awake. Winter silence carried predators. Wolves could smell smoke and meat, drawn to the edge of the camp like shadows circling light. Bears, though mostly hibernating, weren't always predictable. And the worst danger wasn't even animal, it was human. Neighboring groups in desperate hunger could raid at night, drawn by the same glow of warmth you depended on. The night watch was less about heroism and more about paranoia dressed as duty, and it wasn't glamorous. Imagine sitting in near darkness, smoke curling into your eyes, eyelids drooping while you clutch a stick to stir the coals. Your only company is the occasional goat shifting in its sleep and the snoring chorus of your family. Sleep taunts you, but you can't give in. If you nod off and embers die, the wrath of the tribe will make wolves look friendly. To stay awake, watchers found tricks. Some carved little figures from bone scraps, leaving behind tiny artifacts for archaeologists to puzzle over thousands of years later. Others hummed quietly, soft repetitive sounds that wouldn't wake anyone but kept them tethered to the world of the living. There are ethnographic records from Arctic peoples describing watchers whispering stories to the fire itself, as if keeping it company, coaxing it to burn longer. Fire wasn't just fuel, it was treated like a fragile companion, a pet you couldn't afford to neglect. Children, once old enough, were sometimes initiated into watch duty. It wasn't exactly a rite of passage, more like the prehistoric version of you're old enough to do chores now. Stay awake, tend the fire, don't panic if you hear scratching outside. Terrifying, yes, but effective training for adulthood. If you survived night watch, you'd learned responsibility, patience, and the ability to sit in darkness without going mad. And madness was a risk. Hours of staring at embers, alone, in silence your mind wandered. Shadows looked like spirits, cracks in the woods sounded like whispers. Many oral traditions speak of visions and encounters during these lonely vigils, moments when the line between guarding fire and communing with God's blurred. The night watch was practical, yes, but it was also spiritual exposure therapy, stripping you down to raw fear and faith. So while others slept, your eyes stung, your body froze, and your mind danced with shadows. You were both guardian and prisoner of the night. And when the first faint grey of dawn finally smeared across the sky, you passed the torch sometimes, literally, to the next pair of hands. But your sleeplessness carried something else with it, dreams. Because in a world where nights stretched endlessly, dreams weren't just personal, they were communal omens, whispered by the cold and remembered by morning. So, you've survived your turn at the night watch. Or maybe you got lucky and slipped into sleep, pressed against the tribe's collective body blanket. Either way, winter nights didn't just bring silence and fire, they brought dreams. And in a world where the dark lasted 18 hours, dreams weren't side notes, they were entire chapters of life. Long, vivid, sometimes terrifying, sometimes prophetic, always treated as more than your brain just making static. Think about it. You're half-starved, inhaling smoke, wrapped in animal grease, and listening to Windclaw at the hut. Of course your dreams were intense. Physiologists today would call it sleep fragmentation, REM disturbances, or hypoglycemia-induced hallucinations. Back then, people called it messages, not from neurons, but from God's ancestors, spirits, lurking outside in the snow. A dream wasn't private, it was public property, dissected in the morning like weather reports. Shamans in particular leaned on dreams as proof of their calling. Ethnographic records from Siberia, Inuit communities, and circumpolar shamans describe apprentices receiving visions during long winters, guided by animal spirits or ancestral figures who appeared in the half-suffocating haze of the hearth. Did you see a reindeer in your sleep? That wasn't indigestion, it was a summons. Did you dream of a frozen river cracking open? That wasn't random, it was a warning. Dreams were field manuals for surviving a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural blurred, like smoke against snow, and hunger sharpened them. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence alike point out that fasting and starvation amplify dream vividness. Entire nights were spent tossing, stomach growling, visions of feasts or hunts bleeding into waking thought. People dreamed of food, of warmth, of long-dead relatives offering fat or fish. Some dreams comforted, others mocked, dangling imaginary stews in front of bellies that wouldn't be filled. Smoke, too, played its part. Hours of breathing in a poorly vented hut, eyes stinging, lungs coated, it was a recipe for half-poisoned, half-holy visions. Imagine dozing off, your chest heavy with fumes, and suddenly you're flying above the camp, seeing the frozen river stretch for miles, or standing before gods carved from frost. Was it hypoxia? Probably. But to the tribe, it was revelation. Dreams shaped decisions. If the hunters dreamed of wolves, perhaps the next day's path was altered. If someone dreamed of plenty, it lifted morale. Dreams became a communal weather vane, guiding choices when practical knowledge ran out. And in endless winter nights, there was plenty of time to dream, wake, whisper about it, fall asleep again, and dream more. dreams stacked like layers of fur, weaving the night into a surreal tapestry. Children learned early that dreams mattered. They were asked in the morning, "What did you see?" Their responses carried weight, not dismissed as fantasy. Elders, too, offered dream wisdom, though often couched in riddles or stories. The entire camp existed in a feedback loop of sleep and storytelling, blurring where one ended and the other began. So yes, you survived the cold with fire, with silence, with bodies pressed together, but your mind wandered far beyond that hut. You traveled in visions, guided by hunger, smoke, and darkness. And in a world where days were brief and nights endless, dreams weren't just entertainment, they were survival strategies dressed as prophecy. And in the middle of all those dream-filled nights, there was a constant reminder. While the living dreamed, the smallest and most fragile bodies, the children needed extra care. Their survival wasn't in visions or omens, but in the daily vigilance of the tribe, especially at night. Let's be honest, children were the weak link in winter. Soft, loud, leaky little heat wasters who couldn't chop wood or carry water, but still demanded calories you didn't always have. And yet, somehow, every tribe bent over backward to keep them alive. Not out of sentimental modern kids or magical fluff, but because children were the tribe's only insurance policy. Without them, all the fire tending, food hoarding, and smoke breathing amounted to nothing. So children didn't sleep like you imagine. No separate crib, no cozy blanket, no sleep training. They were packed in as carefully as kindling. Infants lived inside fur-lined slings, tucked beneath their mother's clothing, pressed against warm skin day and night. Sleep and feeding blurred into one continuous process. A baby wasn't just a child. It was an extra organ, strapped to a body to keep its temperature steady, and silence was law. Crying too loud in the stillness of winter wasn't tolerated. Not because parents were cruel, but because predators and rival humans had excellent hearing. So babies were hushed fast-breast, fur, rocking, sometimes the taste of chewed food pressed into their mouths. Ethnographic studies from Arctic peoples describe lullabies sung at whispers, soft enough to vibrate in the chest rather than carry through the air. You didn't serenade your child. You sedated them with warmth and rhythm. Dryness mattered more than music. Wetness in the cold was death. Babies were kept wrapped in layers of moss, feathers, or fur to absorb moisture, changed constantly, and tucked back under hides. Moss diapers, archaeologists confirm, weren't just practical, they were life-saving. A damp infant was a frozen infant, and frozen infants didn't make it to spring. Children's sleeping spots were also strategically chosen. In the communal pile, they occupied the center, flanked by adults radiating heat like a living wall. Siblings curled around siblings. Mothers and grandmothers cocooned the smallest ones. Elders sometimes gave up warm places to make sure children survived. There are skeletal records showing malnutrition and stress on older bones, proof that adults sacrificed themselves so the tribe's youngest could push the lineage forward. But survival wasn't tender. If an infant didn't thrive despite every effort, the tribe faced impossible choices. Burial mounds show tiny graves from winter months. Infants lost to hunger, illness, or cold. The community mourned, yes, but it also adjusted, redistributing precious calories to those with a better chance. Harsh arithmetic, but in a frozen economy, everybody had to count. Still, when children did survive, they grew into hardy adults precisely because of this discipline. From their earliest memories, they were trained in silence, in patience, in sleeping pressed against others, in understanding that warmth was never a private luxury but a shared duty. They learned to wake when their mothers shifted to tend the fire, to fall asleep again in darkness without complaint, to live inside rhythms dictated by nature rather than choice. So while you picture childhood as carefree play, theirs was apprenticeship in survival. Their lullabies were whispers, their blankets smelled like reindeer fat, and their bedtime stories doubled as instructions for staying alive. And when dawn came, those children didn't wake to cartoons, they woke to chores. Because as much as they were protected at night, daylight demanded repayment in labor. And who shouldered that labor most predictably in winter? Women, whose roles at night and day intertwined in ways both practical and sacred. By now you've seen how children were tucked into the warmest core of the sleeping heap, but the order around them wasn't random. Nights weren't just a mess of bodies flung together like dirty laundry. They followed rules. Gender roles didn't clock out when the sun went down, they just shifted into nocturnal duties. shaping who slept where, who guarded what, and who was allowed to rest without interruption. Women, for instance, usually kept closest to infants, not just because they nursed, but because their bodies were central heating systems in a world without thermostats. An infant inside a sling, pressed to its mother's chest, could sleep through nights that would freeze a goat stiff. Ethnographic accounts from circumpolar peoples describe women as the axis of warmth in communal sleeping. The fire glowed, yes, but the real furnace was female flesh layered under furs. And then there was the fire itself. In some groups, tending it at night fell to women, sometimes seen as a sacred role, tied to fertility and continuity. Keeping flames alive was like keeping the tribe's heart beating, and who better than those who carried children to also carry fire? In other places, men took turns, especially when danger from raids or predators demanded a more martial presence, but the symbolism stuck. Fire and womb, both vessels of survival, guarded through the dark. Men, on the other hand, were often placed closer to entrances. If a wolf nosed into the tunnel or an enemy crept up, it was men who were expected to stir first, to grab a club or spear, to protect the cluster inside. Romantic perhaps, but less cozy, drafty, colder, and more likely to end with you stumbling into the night half asleep to chase shadows. The distribution of warmth mirrored the distribution of risk. Women and children at the center, protected and insulating. Men at the edges, shielding and exposed. Elders shuffled, depending on their strength, sometimes tucked into corners near the fire, sometimes voluntarily exiled to cooler spots when food was scarce. It was a survival geometry, bodies arranged like architecture, each role reinforcing the tribe's unspoken order, and intimacy followed the same logic. Couples might sleep pressed together, but if duties called fire, infants, guarding, they separated without question. Survival didn't care about romance. A husband didn't steal his wife's warmth if the baby needed it more. Nights weren't about preference, they were about mathematics. Maximize calories saved, heat retained, and bodies alive by dawn. Archaeological traces support this choreography. Sleeping pits and shelters show where patterns, central hollows deeper from repeated use, edges less so. Fire pits centrally placed, surrounded by layers of soot and bone. Ethnographies note similar arrangements in historical accounts. From Siberian yurts to Arctic snowhouses, warmth, roles, and proximity dictated by survival more than affection. Still, these rules weren't oppressive in the modern sense. They were simply obvious. Everyone knew their place, literally. Women guarded life, men guarded space, children absorbed protection, elders gave it up. At night, the tribe rehearsed the same structure it practiced in the day, only now under furs, smoke, and the weight of breath. So while you might picture sleep as a private act, for them it was choreography, almost ritual. Bodies laid down not randomly, but in patterns of duty, warmth, and responsibility. And sometimes, that duty included sacrifice, because not everyone made it through the night, and when death came in winter, it arrived quietly, as part of the same geometry of survival. By now, you've learned the choreography. Women and children in the middle, men at the edges, elders drifting wherever their strengths or lack of it allowed. But let's not pretend everyone who lay down at night always woke up. In winter, death was as present in the hut as fire and smoke. It didn't storm in with drama. It crept quietly into the sleeping pile, stealing warmth from the weakest first. Elders often knew when their turn was coming. In oral traditions from the Arctic and the steppes, there are stories of old ones voluntarily shifting to the colder spots near entrances, making room for children in the core. It wasn't resignation. Exactly, it was strategy. Better one elder freeze than a whole family. And if death came, it often came quietly. One moment, steady breathing, the next, silence. Sometimes the body wasn't even discovered until dawn. When everyone stirred and someone didn't, the cold preserved them in strange ways. Bodies didn't rot quickly. They stiffened, lingered, waiting for burial or, in some cases, until thaw allowed proper rites. Archaeologists have found burials where winter had essentially embalmed the dead before the tribe could. Imagine trying to sleep beside a relative you know won't be breathing by morning. But you can't move them out yet, because frost makes burial impossible. Death shared the bed like an uninvited guest, and children weren't immune. Despite all the care the first slings, the whispered lullabies, the moss changed constantly, some simply didn't survive. Winter graves tell the story. Small skeletons bundled in furs, buried with charms, sometimes with miniature tools or toys. Their short lives recorded in bone, malnutrition, infection, lungs scarred by smoke. Families mourned, yes, but mourning had to fit inside the rhythm of survival. You couldn't collapse into grief when the fire still needed tending. Death wasn't hidden either. Everyone slept close, which meant everyone knew when someone slipped away. A sigh that didn't come back. A body that felt colder than it should. Children grew up with death in arm's reach, learning early that life was fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on the group's ability to keep fire and food flowing. Unlike modern people, shielded from mortality by hospital walls and euphemisms, they slept face to face with it. But here's the eerie part. Death itself carried meaning. If someone died in the night, it wasn't just biology, it was interpreted. Had the gods withdrawn favor? Was the fire offended? Was silence broken? People searched for omens in the timing, in the last dreams shared, in the weather that followed. One elder's death could ripple through camp politics, myth, and morale, becoming not just a loss but a sign. And still, the sleeping pile reformed every night. You didn't stop pressing close because someone had died there yesterday. You couldn't. That was the deal. Life and death wrapped together in the same fur blanket, fire cracking, smoke hanging low. If you woke in the morning, it wasn't a guarantee, it was a gift. And that gift carried obligations to rise, to tell stories, to remember those who hadn't stirred. Because death wasn't just an end, it was part of the nightly economy of survival. And if death pressed close in silence, life pressed closer in story. Which is why, even in the bleakest nights, people whispered myths and genealogies in the dark, weaving bonds that were stronger than fear, stronger even than the cold. If death was one side of the winter bed, story was the other. Packed together in that smoky hut, pressed shoulder to shoulder with kin and beasts, you discovered that night wasn't only for sleep, it was also for weaving bonds. The fire burned low, the cold pressed in, and voices soft, always soft, carried the weight of memory. This was how tribes kept themselves from unraveling in the dark. Stories weren't entertainment, they were survival tools dressed up as myth. Genealogies were recited so no one forgot who belonged to whom, which mattered when resources were scarce and kinship dictated obligation. Myths explained why the sun abandoned you for months at a time, why wolves prowled at the edges of firelight, why the ancestors still demanded respect. These weren't casual campfire tales. They were operating manuals disguised as epics. The silence of winter made them sharper. Words spoken in the dark felt larger, heavier. You didn't shout, you murmured, so everyone leaned closer, listening as smoke curled overhead. A story about how a hunter once angered the spirits wasn't just folklore. It was a warning not to waste meat or mock the fire. Children learned discipline through allegory. Adults reinforced identity through repetition. Story was how the tribe tucked itself in at night, and it wasn't just stories. Songs, whispered almost under breath, shaped the rhythm of nights. Ethnographies among Inuit groups describe games played softly in darkness, riddles passed around, laughter stifled so it wouldn't carry outside. Humor, even in the coldest months, had its place because if you couldn't laugh quietly about your misery, you risked being devoured by it. Proximity turned even quarrels into lessons in restraint. In a space where every cough and sigh was shared, grudges had to be softened, or at least silenced. You didn't get to stomp off into your own room. There was no room. Conflict melted into tolerance, not out of kindness, but out of sheer necessity. Sleeping angry while pressed against your rival cousin, it happened, but warmth outweighed pride. And that, too, reinforced bonds. Grudges couldn't freeze harder than the cold. The social order was reaffirmed each night. Elders told the tales, parents hushed children, shamans interpreted dreams whispered in the morning. Every body, every role, every voice found its place in the rhythm of dark and fire. Anthropologists called this communal cohesion. You would have called it staying sane while snow buried the world outside. And think about it, without those nightly bonds, the sheer monotony of winter could have fractured a group. Imagine sitting in silence for months, pressed against sweaty relatives, with nothing but smoke to stare at. Madness lurked at the edges of silence. Story, laughter, whispered songs, they weren't luxuries, they were shields against despair. So, the social bonds of night were stitched in whispers, breaths, and firelight. They didn't just pass time, they kept the group intact, reminding everyone why they endured, why they pressed close, why they didn't splinter off into frozen solitude. And when the long winter finally broke, and the first thaw softened the ground, those bonds were carried outside into ritual, work, and celebration. Emerging from the hut wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about proving the tribe had survived itself. When spring finally came, it didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a drunk neighbor banging on the door, melting snow into rivers, flooding pits, and sending the first flies buzzing around the hut before you'd even had a chance to stretch. But make no mistake, after months of silence, smoke, and bodies pressed too close for dignity, the thaw felt like resurrection. The tribe emerged blinking into the light, pale and exhausted, carrying the smell of winter on their skin, smoke, grease, and unwashed humanity baked into hides. The first act of survival wasn't celebration, it was cleaning. Bedding dragged out, furs aired in weak sun, shelters repaired after snow sagged their roofs, ash shoveled out of hearths, moss padding replaced, filth scraped from corners. Archaeologists can see it in layers, the thick carbon of winter soot, followed by the fresh scatter of spring activity. Survival left stains, and spring was the season of scrubbing them off. Fires were carried outside too, embers preserved through the thaw, as if they were holy relics. And they were. Without that continuity, you'd have to start over, coaxing flame from sparks like your ancestors had thousands of years earlier. Fire carried from winter into spring wasn't just practical, it was spiritual proof that the tribe had endured. The hearth never died, it only moved. Food, too, changed. Fresh shoots, fish runs, the occasional bird's eggs. Suddenly the monotonous diet of marrow and dried fish cracked open into variety. Stomachs loosened, energy returned. Sleep grew deeper, no longer haunted by starvation dreams. Children, pale but alive, stumbled into sunlight and remembered how to play. Elders who'd survived another winter emerged like prophets, thinner, slower, but treated with reverence for outlasting the cold again. And with survival came ritual. Many cultures marked spring with ceremonies of thanks, offerings to spirits for sparing them, songs of renewal, dances meant to call back abundance. In Siberian and Arctic ethnographies, these spring rites are threaded with both joy and exhaustion, celebrations tempered by the memory of how close the dark season had come to swallowing them. Emerging wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a collective exhale after months of holding breath. Social bonds forged in the silence of winter carried forward. The grudges softened in smoke, the whispered myths, the shared warmth, they shaped how people greeted the new season. Survival had demanded closeness. Now, with the thaw, that closeness didn't dissolve, it became culture. Oral traditions, kinship structures, even taboos, carried the imprint of winter nights spent in fragile unity. But there was always irony. The same thaw that saved you could also drown you, flooding camps, collapsing shelters, turning stored food to rot. Survival was never a neat ending. It was a cycle. The thaw only meant you'd made it this far, not that the next winter wouldn't demand the same dance again. And you knew, as you basked in the brief warmth, that every song of thanks was also a rehearsal for the silence, fire, and pressed bodies waiting at the edge of the year. So yes, you survived. You stepped out of the hut into light, blinking, coughing, thinner but alive. The world smelled of thawing earth instead of smoke, and for a moment you almost forgot how fragile it all was. But deep down, you knew survival wasn't freedom. It was just a pause between winters. Cold is a thief. It creeps under walls, slips between hides, steals heat from skin faster than the body can replace it. In winter camps, warmth wasn't comfort, it was arithmetic. One human body alone shed too much heat into the night air. But pressed against others, side by side, chest to back, an invisible shield formed layers of warmth, held in place like stacked stones against the dark. The logic wasn't theoretical. Skin loses heat rapidly, especially through extremities, and in sub-zero conditions, that loss becomes lethal. Grouped together, bodies conserve energy, reducing exposure and slowing the drain of precious calories. The physics of survival demanded intimacy. It was less about choice and more about insulation, as if each person was one more brick in the wall that kept winter out. Archaeologists and physiologists both read this pattern in the evidence. Bones from northern burials show signs of chronic cold, stress-stunted growth, worn joints, malnutrition. In ethnographic records, the arrangement is described plainly: families and animals in a heap, pressed tight until the edges of bodies blurred. It was never portrayed as romantic. It was pragmatic, an invention of necessity that predates even fire. The mathematics of warmth explained the choreography. 2 bodies cut heat, loss by a third, 3 by half, a dozen by almost all. Humans became insulation for each other, turning the group into a single organism, its warmth pooled at the center like a secret flame. This was thermal economy, measured not in wealth but in breath, in sweat, in skin. To sleep apart in such conditions was to invite death, and death rarely had to wait long in winter. And yet, the strange intimacy of this physics carried more than numbers. It taught people to listen with skin, to sense others through the steady rhythm of breath, to accept the proximity of life and the inevitability of death in the same shared space. It made bodies less private, less individual, more communal, like tools pressed into the same grip. It was a science that people never named, but one they practiced nightly. Survival demanded that no warmth be wasted, no body left unused. Even the dying shared their heat until it slipped away, leaving cold in their place. Every shiver, every sigh, every inch of pressed skin was part of the equation. The cold didn't negotiate, it only measured. And when even the physics of bodies wasn't enough, survival turned to other strategies. Warmth had to be built into the very architecture of shelters, carved into the ground and layered with earth and snow to trap every flicker of heat. Walls were never enough. Even the most carefully built shelters leaked heat into the dark like sieves. Sod houses, snow domes, earth-dug pits, each one was a defense against the cold, but never a victory. The ground swallowed warmth, roofs sagged under snow, and the smoke hole that kept lungs alive also carried precious heat away. The architecture of winter was about compromise. A hut couldn't be too tall, or air would thin and chill above the hearth. Ceilings pressed low enough to make backs ache, entrances forced narrow, crawling tunnels designed not for comfort but to keep drafts from cutting through. Families stooped to live in these spaces, huddling together not out of choice, but because the walls demanded it. The house itself seemed to insist. Stay low, stay close, stay warm. Archaeologists uncover these structures with their layers of soot, compacted earth, and scattered bones. In Siberia, pit houses sunk into the frozen ground show how people used the earth as insulation, drawing stability from its slow temperature shifts. In the Arctic, snow blocks stacked into domes trapped warmth so efficiently that inside air could rise above freezing while outside winds howled at -40. Even mammoth bones, heavy and curved, were pulled into service on the steppes, framing walls later covered in hides. Architecture wasn't built from abundance. It was scavenged from whatever the land grudgingly offered. And still, the cold seeped in. Fires glowed, but their warmth radiated unevenly. The floor closest to the hearth almost unbearable, while the edges remained sharp with frost. Beds weren't beds at all, but depressions in the earth stuffed with moss, grass, or insulation against ground that never lost its chill. Families sprawled across these pits, pressing together because the structure itself couldn't protect them. The walls held out wind, but never winter. It was a strange geometry of survival. Fire in the center, smoke spiraling out, bodies arranged like spokes on a wheel. Men often near the entrance, absorbing the drafts, women and children deeper inside, closer to the glow. Animals tethered or sprawled in corners, their warmth spilling into the room. The hut itself was a skeleton, and the flesh of survival was provided by those inside. Snow muffled the outside world, pressing its silence into the hut. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, breath, and the musk of hides. Darkness ruled, pierced only by firelight, flickering against walls blackened with soot. Privacy dissolved in these spaces. There was no division, no personal corner. Every cough, every whisper, every turn of a body was shared. Architecture didn't permit separation, it enforced togetherness. The walls, then, weren't barriers to keep people apart from cold. They were imperfect shells, fragile shields that bought just enough time for fire and flesh to finish the work. Survival wasn't inside the hut. It was inside the heap of bodies within it. And in that heap, the hearth glowed, small and fragile, the only thing standing between the living and the frozen silence pressing in from outside. But the fire wasn't eternal. It faltered, demanded attention, and sometimes betrayed its keepers with smoke and suffocation. When the architecture failed, and when even the piled bodies weren't enough, the camp turned back to the one force more vital than walls, the fire at its center. Every winter dwelling had its heart, and it wasn't the people, it was the fire. Without flame, the hut collapsed from refuge into tomb. Fire gave light, boiled water, cooked meat, and pushed back the paralysis of cold. But it was also fickle, temperamental, and sometimes lethal. Families lived by its glow, but they also coughed, squinted, and stumbled under its demands. The hearth was never allowed to die. Embers were banked in ash, coaxed gently through the night, tended by hands chosen for patience as much as duty. Relighting flame from sparks wasn't impossible, but it was slow and dangerous when every minute of darkness froze breath to skin. Archaeological layers reveal ash upon ash, proof that the hearth never went cold. For months, the fire was as continuous as heartbeat, and if it stopped, so did life. But fire's warmth was uneven. Those nearest sweated, flushed red, while others at the edges huddled with frost still creeping under their hides. Heat leaked upward, pooling uselessly near the smoke hole, leaving toes numb even as cheeks burned. Fire was power, but power poorly distributed, forcing people to press together and pool body heat to fill in its gaps. And the smoke hallways, the smoke. Ventilation was a gamble. Too small a hole, and the room filled with choking haze, lungs seared, eyes stung. Too large, and heat fled upward in a rush. Bones and teeth unearthed from ancient graves show traces of chronic smoke inhalation, evidence that survival was bartered at the cost of damaged lungs. Children grew up coughing, elders wheezed through winters, and no one was spared. Fire saved, but it also poisoned, one breath at a time. Fuel was its own economy. Wood was precious where trees grew sparse. Driftwood scavenged along coasts. Dung dried into brittle cakes. Fat burned in stone lamps. Nothing was wasted, not even the unpleasant. Archaeological finds of soot-blackened lampstones and ash-packed pits testify to a rhythm. Feed the fire. Watch it eat, and know that without it, hunger and cold would eat you instead. Fire wasn't just utility. It was sacred. Nearly every northern tradition framed it as a being, a companion that needed feeding, coaxing, respect. People whispered thanks to flames, placed offerings in embers, and taught children never to mock it. Folklore remembered houses burned in punishment, or winters cursed when fire was mistreated. This wasn't metaphor, it was risk management superstition sharpened into survival code. And still, fire was never enough. Its circle of heat was small, its appetite endless, its smoke unrelenting. Families leaned into each other not because fire failed completely, but because it always fell short. Warmth was layered. Fire first, bodies second, hides third. One without the others, and the hut crumbled into cold. Fire ruled the center of the dwelling, yes, but it couldn't rule silence. Beyond its flicker, cold pressed in, vast and indifferent. And in that silence, survival took another shape less visible than flame, but just as vital. In the geometry of winter sleep, not everyone was equal. The center of the heap was reserved, always, for the youngest. Infants and children formed the fragile core, wrapped in hides, tucked against mother's skin, and buried beneath the warmth of every available body. Their survival was too important to gamble on the edges. If they froze, the lineage froze with them. Infants rarely slept alone. They lived in fur-lined slings, pressed directly to their mothers' chests, nursing not only for food, but for heat. Archaeological finds of hide carriers stuffed with feathers and moss confirm this intimacy. The child became an extension of the mother's body, fed and insulated around the clock. Warmth was the currency, and mothers spent themselves lavishly, carrying babies like smoldering embers that had to be shielded at all costs. Moisture was the great enemy. Even the slightest dampness could tip a child into hypothermia. Moss packed into crude diapers was changed constantly, dried by firelight, and replaced before it froze against skin. Burial sites of infants wrapped in fur and lined with moss testify to how carefully tribes managed this detail. Dryness was survival. Negligence was fatal. Silence was equally critical. A baby's cry could echo through the still air outside, carrying further than anyone wanted. Wolves, lynx, even hungry neighbors might hear what the tribe wanted hidden, the sound of vulnerable life. Mothers hushed quickly, rocking and nursing in near silence. Lullabies reduced to vibrations more than songs. Ethnographic accounts from Arctic peoples describe whispered tunes, words too soft to carry, breaths matched to the fire's rhythm. Music in winter wasn't for joy, it was for concealment. The placement of children in the communal bed followed a strict order. Infants in the innermost circle, children clustered beside them, mothers wrapped around fathers, and men toward the colder edges, absorbing drafts and guarding entrances. Elders shifted depending on food and strengths, sometimes near the core, sometimes voluntarily further out, conceding warmth to the young. This wasn't sentimentality, it was mathematics, a nightly redistribution of heat to ensure continuity. But not every child survived. The archaeological record is blunt. Small graves dug in frozen soil, skeletons showing signs of malnutrition, infection, or cold. Families mourned, but mourning was fitted into survival. A child lost in winter was buried swiftly, wrapped in fur, sometimes with miniature tools or charms, as if equipped for a journey cut short. The living rearranged themselves and carried on. For those who did survive, winter trained them from birth. Children grew into bodies accustomed to silence, patience, and the discipline of shared warmth. They learned early to lie still under heavy hides, to fall asleep pressed into ribs and shoulders, to wake without complaint when jostled by the fire's demands. Childhood wasn't freedom, it was apprenticeship in the art of endurance. The core of warmth was fragile, but it was also the engine of continuity. Children embodied the gamble of winter. Every calorie fed to them, every hide draped around them, every body curved protectively, was an investment in a future that might never arrive. And when the warmth of human bodies wasn't enough, families turned to their other companions, beasts, whose heat, breath, and presence tipped the balance between survival and silence. The human pile alone wasn't always enough. In the coldest months, survival meant recruiting every possible body, even those with hooves, paws, or horns. Animals weren't kept at a polite distance. They were pulled into the same smoky hut, transformed from beasts of burden into walking furnaces. Heat was heat, and no one argued about the smell when the temperature outside could crack stone. Dogs were the most faithful heaters. Archaeological remains near hearths tell the story burials of dogs curled close to humans, their bones mingling with those they'd slept beside in life. They guarded, hunted, and warmed, pressed against feet or tucked beside children. In some traditions, they were believed to guide souls into the afterlife, which seems fitting when their warmth probably saved countless souls in the here and now. But dogs weren't alone. In Siberian winters, reindeer sometimes bedded down inside shelters, their bulk radiating heat into the cramped space. Goats and sheep, in more southern camps, were tethered in corners, steaming breath mixing with human snores. The hut became a menagerie of necessity. People, animals, fire, and smoke, all layered into the same fragile ecosystem. To step inside was to enter an arc of warmth, chaotic and pungent, but effective. The logic was simple. Every body burned calories, every body shed heat, and in conditions where fire failed to reach the far corners, the breath of a goat might mean the difference between frostbite and survival. Children pressed themselves against flanks, small hands tangled in fur, their sleep kept steady by the rhythm of animal breathing. Dung, too, joined the cycle. Dried in advance, it became fuel, feeding the fire that fed the people. What was waste by daylight was warmth by night. Ethnographies recording steppe and Arctic practices noted the same rule everywhere. Nothing was wasted, not even excrement. Survival stripped disgust away, leaving only utility. And yet, intimacy with animals wasn't merely practical. It seeped into the spiritual fabric of these communities. Dogs became guardians, reindeer became cosmological bridges, cattle became symbols of continuity. To sleep beside them was to collapse the boundary between human and animal, to acknowledge that survival didn't belong to one species alone. Warmth braided lives together, and mythology followed. Still, it wasn't comfortable. Sleep was fractured by the sounds of beasts, shifting, snorting, chewing, relieving themselves in the dark. The air was thick with their musk, layered over human sweat and smoke. Privacy dissolved further. The hut was a chorus of species enduring the night together. The line between barn and bedroom disappeared. Archaeological traces of fur embedded in floor sediments, animal bones found near hearths, and tether marks on posts all confirm what oral traditions still remember. People did not survive winter alone. They survived entangled with fire, with kin, with animals pressed so close that breath and warmth blurred. And if animals shared heat, so too did humans share themselves. Bodies rearranged nightly into a living quilt. Fire in the center, beasts steaming in corners, children nestled in the warmest crevice, and families pressed together until the architecture itself seemed to breathe. This wasn't affection. It wasn't choice. It was the cold rewriting intimacy as mathematics. The sleeping heap wasn't random. It followed an order, invisible but strict, rehearsed every night until it became instinct. Gender-shaped, where bodies lay, who absorbed drafts, who tended the fire, who curled around children, and who guarded the fragile entrance from whatever prowled outside. Even in darkness, survival carried a choreography. Women, with infants strapped against their skin, claimed the center. Their warmth was doubled, their own bodies radiating heat, and their milk fueling tiny furnaces pressed against them. The firstling wasn't just a cradle. It was insulation, one life strapped to another, until both burned warmer than either could alone. Ethnographic records from circumpolar peoples describe this arrangement as so consistent that it might as well have been law. Women at the heart, hit-givers, whispering lullabies too soft to travel beyond the hut's walls. Men, in contrast, drifted toward the edges, not out of neglect, but out of duty. The coldest spots near entrances, under drafty seams, fell to them, their bodies absorbing chill before it reached the core. Their role wasn't only insulation, it was defense. A wolf nosing through the entrance, or worse, a desperate rival drawn by the glow of smoke, would encounter men first. Weapons lay close at hand, spears or clubs within reach, as much part of the sleeping arrangement as fur blankets. The division wasn't sentimental, it was practical, honed over generations. The geometry of the hut reproduced the geometry of daily life, women guarding continuity, men guarding boundaries. In sleep as in waking, roles held. Warmth wasn't only a biological resource, it was a social one, distributed according to need, strength, and risk. Elders occupied a shifting place in this pattern. In good years, with food secure, they lay close to the fire, their brittle bodies shielded by younger kin. In lean winters, many chose the edges, ceding warmth to children and parents of infants. Archaeological traces in burial sites hint at the cost. Older skeletons showing advanced malnutrition, bones thinned from sacrifice, lives shortened by repeated exposure. Their absence at the center wasn't neglect, but a calculation the future carried more weight than the past. These nightly positions hardened into memory. Children grew up knowing exactly where they belonged, who lay beside them, whose body pressed against theirs. They learned that sleeping wasn't choice but discipline, an extension of survival roles they'd inherit in adulthood. Every body was a brick in a wall, and the wall had no gaps. The architecture of gendered sleep also shaped intimacy. Couples might share closeness, but the needs of the group outweighed personal comfort. A husband shifted to the draft if his child needed the warmest spot. A wife kept her baby at her chest, even if it meant turning away from her partner. Affection bent to necessity. Romance was subordinated to physics. Archaeological evidence supports these arrangements, deeper where near hearths. Clustered remains showing family groups, soot-darkened ceilings where women and children likely lived closest to fire, while men left traces nearer entrances. The hut was a map, and each body its marker. But warmth and order didn't guarantee safety. Night brought stillness, yes, but also danger. The same silence that preserved heat also carried sound too far, inviting predators or strangers to the hut. And so survival wasn't only about where people slept, was about how quiet they could remain while doing it. Night, inside a winter hut, wasn't just dark and smoky, it was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind city people chase with noise-cancelling headphones, but the sort of silence that presses down like a weight. Words were rationed, whispers passed sparingly, because every breath of sound seemed capable of cracking the fragile shell that kept the world out. Cold air plays tricks with sound. It carries farther, cleaner, sharper. A cough in the middle of the hut could escape through the smoke hole and travel across frozen fields like a signal flare. Predators didn't need much encouragement. Wolves, lynx, sometimes even hungry bears, drawn from uneasy hibernation each prowled at the edges of light, listening. A cry, a laugh, too loud, the wail of a baby left untended. All of it risked becoming an invitation. So silence became discipline. Babies were hushed instantly, tucked to breasts, rocked against skin, until their cries dwindled into muffled hiccups. Children learned young that tears were dangerous, tantrums unthinkable. Lullabies existed, but they were whispers, chest-deep vibrations, more felt than heard. Entire oral traditions of the North describe songs meant to soothe without carrying beyond the hut. Melodies swallowed by hides before they could travel into the night. Predators weren't the only listeners. Other humans could be worse. Scarcity drove raids, and smoke rising from a vent was proof of food, fuel, life worth stealing. The stillness of winter carried every sound farther, and so tribes learned that their best defense wasn't shouting, but silence. Quiet nights were safer nights, and silence itself became a shield. Inside, this discipline shaped intimacy. Conversation shrank into murmurs, stories told in fragments, gestures replacing words. A sigh, the shift of a body, the rhythm of breath, these became languages of their own. Families grew fluent in silence, reading each other without speaking, sensing fear or reassurance in the smallest twitch. Archaeological traces can't capture silence, but they hint at it. Infant burials from winter months, tiny graves lined with fur, tell how fragile discipline was, how one cry too loud, or one sickness too prolonged, could end in tragedy. Ethnographies recording Arctic traditions note the same. Children trained in quiet, adults carrying silence like armor, sound rationed as carefully as food. But silence was never absolute. The hut itself was alive with noise, the crack of wood in the hearth, the shifting of animals tethered in corners, the muffled cough of an elder. The air vibrated with small, ordinary sounds, a background hum of life compressed into one smoky chamber. What mattered was not letting those sounds spill outward. Inside, the noise was tolerated, even comforting. Outside, it was invitation to disaster. This silence, heavy and relentless, also fed imagination. Dreams stretched larger in the absence of chatter. Stories whispered at the edge of hearing took on weight. The cold pressed sound flat, and into that stillness the mind projected spirits, omens, and fears. Silence was survival, yes, but it was also the canvas on which mythology painted itself. And when silence wrapped the hut, enforced an absolute, danger still pressed at the door. Because while quiet could hide a family from predators, it couldn't protect them from each other. Packed so close, breathing the same smoke, warmth and sickness traveled hand in hand, and survival carried its own cost. Survival through winter wasn't free. The same closeness that saved families from the cold also turned huts into incubators of disease. Warmth kept bodies alive, but it also kept illnesses alive, carried breath to breath, cough to cough, until everyone was tangled in the same infection. Archaeological evidence makes the cost visible. Skeletons with stunted growth from repeated childhood illness, ribs thickened from chronic lung infections, teeth worn by grit mixed into food prepared in smoky air. Microscopic analysis of ancient bones reveals carbon particles embedded in them prove that smoke filled lungs until breathing itself became labor. The fire saved, but every inhalation was also slow poisoning. Crowding made it worse. 20 bodies in one room meant parasites thrived. Lice nested in fur, fleas in bedding, worms in guts. The smoky air disguised the stench, but it didn't stop the cycle. Children scratched until skin bled. Elders wasted from infections that had no treatment. Ethnographic accounts from Arctic and Siberian peoples confirmed this. Winter was less a season of rest, and more a season of sickness endured in silence. Diet compounded the risks. Months of dried meat, marrow, and fish meant vitamins dwindled. Bones weakened, teeth crumbled, skin cracked under the stress of deficiency. Archaeologists studying mummies from frozen burials often find signs of scurvy, anemia, and malnutrition. Survival was never clean. It was a constant negotiation between what the body needed and what the land refused to provide. The hut itself was a trap. Ventilation meant freezing drafts. No ventilation meant smoke choking everyone inside. Families balanced on that line daily, adjusting holes in roofs, shifting hides, waving smoke away from infants too small to cough it out. But the damage built over time. Blackened ceilings still cling to soot centuries later. fossilized proof that lungs once matched them in color. And then there were accidents. Fire was both savior and threat. Sparks leaped onto hides, turning the only shelter into a pyre. People stumbled in the dark, fell against flames, burned flesh, adding its own acrid scent to the hut. Ethnographies note taboos built around fire, rituals of respect, whispered thanks, prohibitions against careless behavior, because everyone knew a moment's negligence could end in ash. Yet despite the risk, no one abandoned the system. Bodies pressed together still meant warmth, and warmth still meant survival. Health was fragile, but cold was absolute. You could endure smoke-choked lungs, parasites, chronic cough. You could not endure freezing. In the balance of threats, illness was the slower enemy. And in those conditions, even sickness became woven into meaning. Shamans interpreted fevers as spirit visitations, coughs as signs of imbalance, dreams disturbed by illness as warnings or omens. The line between disease and the sacred blurred, not because people were ignorant, but because every experience had to be framed in a way that offered endurance. If the gods sent coughs, then at least coughs had purpose. The risk was constant, but it was borne in silence, endured as part of the season's burden. And when breath grew heavy, when illness deepened, when someone stilled in the night, the group pressed closer around the living, conserving warmth for those who remained. And in that closeness, warmth was no longer just physical, it became cultural, spiritual, mythic. Night after night, the sleeping heap was both shelter and ceremony. Pressed together under hides, bodies warmed more than flesh. They warmed stories, myths, and the fragile threads that tied a community to itself. Night wasn't only for sleep. It was for listening, remembering, and weaving the invisible net that made survival bearable. The hearth became a stage. Flames flickered across soot-dark walls, turning smoke into ghosts and shadows into actors. Around that glow, elders whispered genealogies, not as trivia but as survival codes. Who was kin? Who owed allegiance? Who could marry whom when the thaw returned? In small communities, forgetting a name could mean breaking a bond, and breaking bonds was more dangerous than hunger. Animals in the hut weren't just radiators, they were mythic partners. Dogs stretched at feet were imagined as guides who would one day lead souls to the afterlife. Reindeer resting in corners were seen as bridges between worlds, carrying prayers as easily as sleds. The same beasts whose breath kept infants warm at night appeared in stories as divine messengers. Spiritual intimacy mirrored physical intimacy. Humans couldn't sleep apart from animals because, in myth, they never truly had. Dreams played their part. In smoke-heavy huts, with lungs half poisoned and bellies half empty, dreams arrived vivid and strange. Shamans learned to read them, calling visions messages from spirits. Did someone dream of a frozen river splitting open? That was a warning. Did a child see an ancestor offering food? That was guidance. Sleep wasn't private, it was communal prophecy. In the morning, dreams were retold like weather forecasts, folded into the logic of survival. Even silence had ritual weight. The hush enforced to avoid predators became sacred discipline, a practice of restraint that shaped character. Lullabies whispered more in vibration than in sound, carried traces of prayer. Some oral traditions describe winter nights as times when words froze, when speech itself belonged to the gods, rationed to humans in fragments. Quiet was not emptiness but reverence. Sickness too was recast into myth. A fever could be the body fighting spirits. A cough, a sign that balance between human and hearth had been disturbed. Ritual cleansings, charms burned in the fire, whispered invocations all framed illness as dialogue with unseen forces. It was less about cure and more about giving suffering meaning, about transforming weakness into something endurable. And death, when it came, slid seamlessly into ritual. A body stilled in the night wasn't just absence. It became an omen, a reminder whispered into stories. Children grew up, not shielded from death, but folded into its presence, taught that warmth and loss were always intertwined. The cultural and spiritual dimensions of night weren't luxuries layered onto survival. They were survival. Stories passed the hours, silence enforced discipline, animals became kin, dreams pointed paths. Rituals explained what couldn't be controlled. Warmth was physical, yes, but it was also social and sacred. And when the thaw finally came, when families stumbled, blinking into light after months of compressed darkness, what they carried wasn't just bodies that had endured. It was bonds, myths, and rituals pressed as deeply into memory as the smell of smoke pressed into hides. Survival didn't end with spring, it repeated, season after season, a cycle of warmth, silence, and closeness that defined life itself. Spring didn't erase winter, it only pressed pause. The thaw melted snow, but not memory. Families dragged hides outside to air, scraped soot from walls, and shook lice from bedding. But the patterns of survival silence, fire, pressed bodies, remained etched into habit. The cycle was annual, relentless, as predictable as the return of the sun, and every thaw carried the shadow of its opposite. Archaeology tells the rhythm in layers, thick deposits of soot marking long winters, followed by thinner bands of food waste and tool debris from brighter seasons. The ground itself recorded the pendulum swing of abundance and scarcity, and in oral traditions, the cycle was folded into cosmology: light and dark, hunger and feast, warmth and cold, each one feeding the next. Survival was never permanent. It was always provisional, borrowed against the debt of the next freeze. Continuity came not just from enduring the cold, but from rehearsing its lessons. Children raised in silence carried that discipline into adulthood, shushing their own infants as quickly as they had been hushed. Women taught daughters the art of tending fire and bodies simultaneously, wrapping newborns in hides as their mothers had done. Men trained sons in the stoicism of sleeping near drafts, guarding entrances, carrying spears in reach even in sleep. Elders passed down stories of winters worse than the present one, reminding everyone that endurance was possible because it had been done before. Animals, too, remained part of the cycle. Dogs slept at feet in winter, then ran at heels in spring hunts, then returned again to the pile when cold returned. Reindeer or cattle moved outside with the thaw, only to be brought in again with the first frost. The intimacy of shared breath in winter was seasonal, but it always came back. The hut was never fully emptied of its animal kin. It was only rearranged according to the weather's demands. Even death, winter's most insistent companion, was folded into the cycle. Graves dug in thawed soil reminded survivors of those lost in frozen months. Spirits were honored in spring rituals, names spoken aloud to prevent them from slipping into silence. The dead became part of continuity, their absence absorbed into the rhythm of seasons, like another kind of harvest, painful, but inevitable. Continuity also meant repetition of suffering. Every winter, lungs filled again with smoke, skin crawled again with parasites, hunger gnawed again at bellies. But suffering wasn't meaningless. It shaped the culture, reinforced bonds, and reminded each generation that warmth was never personal, it was communal. Survival was shared, and so was discomfort. This cycle shaped identity. Communities defined themselves not by abundance, but by endurance. To be part of the group was to have survived winters together, to have pressed bodies into the same smoky darkness and woken again to light. Kinship wasn't only blood, it was forged in the nightly heap of warmth, in the silence that kept predators at bay, in the fire coaxed alive morning after morning. So when spring light finally stretched long across the horizon, survival wasn't celebrated as triumph. It was acknowledged as reprieve. Everyone knew the cycle would return, knew that winter would again demand silence, fire, and shared flesh. Continuity wasn't victory, it was resilience rehearsed endlessly. A rhythm older than memory. The huts rotted, the fires cooled, the bones settled into earth, but the pattern remained. Families pressed together with animals for warmth, year after year, century after century, carrying forward the quiet knowledge that survival is rarely noble, rarely clean. It is messy, crowded, smoky, smelly, and endlessly repeated. Night has a way of magnifying sound until it feels like the world is listening back. In cold air, the effect is merciless. A cough inside a hut can slide through the smoke hole and ripple across a frozen field as clearly as a shout. Even the crunch of someone shifting on straw echoes strangely, sharper, like bones breaking. Communities living in such silence quickly discovered that noise was not just an annoyance, it was an announcement, one that predators and enemies were more than willing to receive. Physics made the lesson obvious. Cold air is denser, carrying vibrations farther, cutting away the fuzziness that muffles sound and warmth. Hunters could hear wolves long before they saw them. Raiders could follow a baby's cry carried across ice as if it were a beacon. And so silence became not preference but strategy, a kind of acoustic camouflage woven into daily survival. The discipline spread into every corner of life. Inside huts, fires crackled, hides rustled, dogs shifted, but human voices shrank into whispers. Conversation was rationed like food, meted out sparingly, careful not to spill into the night. Children learned early that night was not for noise. Their training wasn't framed as politeness, but as necessity. A wail could invite wolves, a laugh could draw strangers closer. Quiet became a form of architecture, as important to the structure of the dwelling as walls or roofs. Archaeologists can't hear the past, but they can trace silence in its residues. Infant burials in winter soil speak to the stakes, cries that couldn't be contained, fevers that refused to hush, dangers that descended when sound betrayed a camp. Ethnographic accounts from the Arctic, Siberia, and highland villages echo the same pattern. Night required stillness. The air itself was hostile, ready to betray the careless, but silence was more than a survival trick. It became ritual, layered with meaning. People began to believe that sound itself attracted not just predators, but spirits. To speak too loudly at night wasn't only dangerous, it was disrespectful. Words were thought to pierce the fragile boundary between the living and the other world. And if words escaped into the dark might answer back. So the night was padded with restraint. Stories that by day were told with flourish were reduced to murmurs. Songs that carried across valleys shrank into chest-deep vibrations, felt more than heard. The stillness of winter wasn't just endured, was sanctified, turned into a discipline that fused practical caution with spiritual awe. And from this hush, a new problem emerged: how to soothe children, speak to kin, or even argue without breaking the unwritten law of silence. The solution wasn't in louder words, but in softer ones, in vibrations and murmurs, designed to comfort without carrying. Whispered lullabies replaced open songs, shaping a nocturnal language meant only for those inside the hut. Silence at night wasn't just clever acoustics. It became a threshold, a way of drawing a line between what belonged to humans and what drifted in from the other side. Many cultures believed the hours after dusk weren't fully theirs. Darkness belonged to spirits, ancestors, and things that didn't always have names. To speak too much was to trespass, to draw attention from forces better left unbothered. Folklore from across the north and far beyond repeats the same caution. Noise calls what shouldn't be called. An owl's cry wasn't just an owl, it was a spirit mocking you. A hyena laughing in the African dark wasn't simply an animal, it was the sound of spirits stirred awake. In the Andes, night silence was thought to keep mountain beings content. Break it, and you risked illness, misfortune, or worse. The logic, once again, was both practical and uncanny. Predators and rivals did indeed hear noise, but instead of separating the natural and supernatural, people braided them together. Wolves became embodiments of restless ancestors. Raiders became messengers of gods. In this worldview, keeping silent did double duty. It protected against teeth and claws, but also against the gaze of spirits who might slip through gaps in the night. The hut was imagined as a fragile bubble of order, a pocket of human warmth inside a universe of indifference. Inside, fire-kin stories whispered into hides. Outside, cold, predators, spirits, waiting to be acknowledged by sound. By not calling out, not breaking silence, people held the boundary taut, refusing to invite what lingered beyond. The dark was always listening. Ethnographic records capture this discipline in ritual form. Among Siberian shamans, silence was observed before night ceremonies, a way to keep the spirits calm until the ritual began. In West Africa, villages fell quiet after dusk, with sound discipline explained not only as fear of enemies, but as respect for ancestral presence. Across the Arctic, families whispered that noise might disturb the spirits of animals whose lives had been taken in the hunt, inviting vengeance into the hut. Children were taught that spirits had sensitive ears. A loud laugh might wake them, a careless shout might offend them. These warnings weren't bedtime stories. They were survival lessons framed as cosmology. By the time children grew into adults, silence had been trained into their bones, reinforced by both fear and habit, and so silence became a ritual in itself, not merely the absence of noise, but an offering proof of discipline, deference, and awareness. Stillness at night wasn't empty, it was full, charged with respect and dread. The very act of withholding sound became sacred. Yet humans still needed to soothe, to sing, to tell, which meant silence had to be broken carefully, bent without shattering. And so, In the hush of the hut, voices adapted, shrinking into vibrations, carrying songs not to the outside world, but only to the flesh and bone pressed close enough to feel them. Even in the most disciplined silence, there were mouths to feed, children to calm, and fears to soothe. Humans couldn't simply stop speaking, but they learned to change the way sound moved through the night. Instead of carrying across fields and snow, voices were pressed into bodies, softened into whispers, reshaped into something private and close. Lullabies are the clearest trace of this adjustment. Across cultures, nighttime songs weren't sung to be heard, they were sung to be felt. A mother's chest vibrated against an infant's ear, the hum more like heartbeat than melody. Arctic ethnographies record mothers who barely mouthed the words, turning tunes into throat-deep murmurs. The point wasn't performance, it was rhythm, vibration, and comfort that didn't escape into the night air. Even adults leaned on this quiet music. In the smoke and closeness of a hut, a whispered chant could steady nerves, reminding everyone that breath still moved, that warmth still lingered. The fire hummed its own rhythm, crackling in time with low voices. Together, these sounds created an interior world distinct from the silence outside a cocoon of whispers, a chamber music of survival. Muted speech became the language of night. Arguments, when they had to happen, were reduced to hissed exchanges, sharp words bitten short so they wouldn't carry. Affection, too, took quieter forms. A hand brushed against another, a breath shared more meaning than any declaration. Living pressed together under furs, communication collapsed into gestures and fragments, an entire language trimmed down to fit inside silence. Children learned this language early. Parents hushed them with gentle pressure on the lips, taught them that tears were dangerous, taught them how to whisper before they could speak clearly. It was discipline wrapped in tenderness. Ethnographic parallels stretch wide, Inuit mothers placing hands over infants' mouths, Siberian parents inventing wordless games in darkness, West African lullabies sung at the edge of inaudibility. Everywhere, the logic was the same: noise might kill, quiet might save, and there was poetry in this restraint. To whisper was to claim intimacy, to use words only for those close enough to share breath. Storytelling in the dark took on a conspiratorial quality. A myth told in fragments, broken by long pauses, felt heavier than the same tale shouted at a fire under open sky. Silence gave words weight, whispers made them precious. Archaeology leaves only faint hints of this sonic world. Charcoal, soot, cramped floor plans all suggest interiors where whispers would have carried better than shouts. Oral traditions preserve more, remembering that certain songs could only be sung softly, certain names only spoken in hushed tones. Even in memory, silence survives as an echo. But the hut couldn't live on whispers alone. Communication still had to carry without breaking the quiet, which meant the night demanded another adaptation. Words surrendered entirely, replaced by the sharp grammar of gestures, touch, and movement. A raised hand, a shift in posture, a finger pressed to lips. This became the true speech of night. In the stillness of night, words became liabilities. Too much sound slipped through the seams of the hut and vanished into the waiting dark. So people leaned on gestures instead, creating a vocabulary of movement, sharp enough to communicate, yet quiet enough to remain hidden. Silence bred its own language, stitched together with touch, posture, and the flicker of hands in firelight. A hand pressed gently on a child's chest meant, lie still. A finger to the lips, hush. A slow tilt of the head toward the entrance, danger. Anthropologists observing Arctic and steppe families noted how often entire conversations passed without a word. Just the shift of an arm, a subtle glance, the weight of a hand on someone's shoulder. These gestures weren't supplements to language. At night, they were the language. The closeness of sleeping heaps made the system inevitable. With bodies stacked against one another, it was easier to communicate by pressure than by sound. A nudge meant move over. A tap meant wake up. A brush of fur against the arm meant shift toward the fire. Even affection was expressed this way. Parents stroked children's hair, couples pressed feet together, siblings squeezed hands under blankets. In the dark, warmth and touch became syntax. The fire itself helped translate. Shadows stretched across walls, gestures enlarged into silhouettes that others could read from across the hut. A hand raised slowly into the glow was visible to all without a word. Archaeologists studying soot-blackened ceilings and circular hearth layouts can glimpse this nocturnal stage. The fire was more than heat. It was illumination for silent speech. Discipline was strict. To speak when gesture would do was to waste sound, to risk attention. Children were corrected, not with words, but with a hand placed firmly over their mouths, followed by the quiet signal they should have used. Over time, the habit sank deep. Ethnographic accounts from Siberia describe hunters communicating silently on winter trails with the same signals they'd used inside huts. The night's language became the day's as well, useful in stalking prey, in avoiding rival groups, in honoring silence before ritual. Gesture also carried ritual meaning. Some cultures believed that certain movements could repel spirits: a hand raised, palm outward, a slow circling motion near the fire. These weren't decorations, they were survival charms performed without breaking the discipline of quiet. Spirits, it was said, could hear but not see well. Gesture filled the gap where sound could not go. And with time, silence and gesture became inseparable from identity. To belong to the group meant knowing the language of night. Outsiders might fumble, speak too loudly, or fail to understand a signal, and in that failure revealed themselves as dangerous, unreliable, not truly kin. The quiet grammar of movement wasn't just communication, it was boundary, drawing the line between those inside the circle and those beyond it. But of course, even gestures needed guardians. Not everyone could sleep through the night. Someone had to tend the fire, someone had to watch the door, someone had to hold stillness on behalf of everyone else. And so silence was never left unattended, was entrusted to watchers who carried the burden of vigilance in the dark. Silence wasn't passive, it needed guarding. And so every night, someone was chosen or volunteered, or simply couldn't sleep, to sit awake and keep the hush intact. The watcher wasn't glamorous. Their role was part sentinel, part janitor, part reluctant priest of the dark. While others pressed together for warmth, the watcher lingered closer to the entrance or the fire, shoulders hunched, eyes raw from smoke and fatigue. Their duties were as practical as they were symbolic. Fire had to be kept alive. Embers stirred, fuel added at just the right moment. Let the flame die, and everyone risked freezing. Let it flare too bright, and smoke thickened, choking the hut. The watcher's hands, blackened with soot, decided whether the family breathed or suffocated. Archaeological layers of ash and charcoal testify to this constant tending, evidence that flames were managed through every hour of the night. But watching wasn't only about fire. The entrance had to be guarded. Predators were opportunists: wolves, sniffing for weakness, raiders prowling for smoke. In many traditions, the night guard carried a spear, club, or even a charm of bone or antler. Not because it guaranteed safety, but because the gesture itself mattered. To watch was to declare, someone is awake, someone is listening. Spirits too were said to respect vigilance. Ethnographic records from Siberia and the Arctic described night guards muttering protective prayers or wearing amulets while they tended fires, their wakefulness doubling as ritual defense. The role carried stigma as well as honor. Watchers often described feeling polluted by their proximity to danger smoke, clinging to lungs, shadows to memory. In some communities, they were ritually cleansed at dawn, washed with snow or smoke to strip away the residue of night. Others treated the position as initiation, a way to test courage against silence. Children on the verge of adulthood might be assigned to night watch, trembling in the half-dark, learning discipline by resisting the urge to speak, to fidget, to wake others for comfort. Fatigue pressed hardest. Hours dragged. The fire's glow warped shadows, turning familiar bodies into eerie figures. Dreams played tricks on waking eyes. Many cultures warned that watchers were vulnerable to visions, seeing spirits in the flicker of smoke. Some whispered that the very act of staying awake drew attention from the other side. A careless movement, a crack too loud, and the watcher's silence might betray the group. Responsibility was heavy, but failure heavier. The watcher embodied the paradox of night's silence. Everyone rested because one person could not. Their wakefulness carried the group. Their stillness preserved the larger stillness. And when dawn broke, they slipped wordlessly back into the pile, smoke-stained and hollow-eyed, trading their vigilance for the warmth of others. Yet danger wasn't only at the threshold. The sounds outside, the howl of wolves, the cry of owls, the laughter of hyenas, were never merely animals. Too many, these noises belonged to spirits themselves, roaming the dark, reminding humans why silence was necessary. And so the watcher's ears, strained and sleepless, had to pass every sound, predator, human, or spirit pressing at the boundary. The watcher's ears didn't just strain for wolves. Every cry in the night was doubled animal and spirit layered together, inseparable. A wolf's howl was hunger, yes, but also omen. An owl's call warned of death. A hyena's laugh was never simply teeth in the dark. It was laughter borrowed from something older, something patient. Predators at night were rarely only beasts. They were masks worn by spirits, reminders that silence was a shield against both fur and phantom. This interpretation made sense in worlds where the line between natural and supernatural wasn't a line at all. Animals threatened physically, but their cries pierced deeper, echoing into belief. Ethnographies working among circumpolar peoples recorded that wolves were seen as emissaries of ancestor spirits, testing human discipline. In West Africa, nightbirds were feared not for their claws but for their voices, said to mimic the dead. Across the Americas, coyotes and owls alike were cast as messengers, their cries instructions to hush, to respect the dark. Practical logic hid inside the myth. Loud noises did attract predators. Crying infants could draw scavengers. But framing those dangers as spirits gave silence authority beyond survival. Parents didn't tell children to hush because wolves might hear. They told them to hush because spirits would come. Myth sharpened caution into obedience. Archaeology captures the presence of these animals in bones scattered near camps, claw marks etched into shelters, feathers found buried with charms. Yet it is the stories preserved in oral tradition that reveal the deeper truth. Silence was not simply absence of sound, but a spiritual barricade. Noise opened doors, invited what prowled outside to step inside. The watch was never just about wolves, it was about keeping the border intact. Predators reinforced the choreography of the hut. Dogs, trusted allies, lay closest to the edges, their ears pricked for the faintest crack outside. Humans listened through them, reading tension in their growls, comfort in their sighs. If dogs stirred, the silence thickened, bodies stiffened, gestures rippled through the heap. No one spoke. To break silence when predators circled was to challenge not only nature but the spirits it concealed. And so the night filled with a peculiar irony. The less people spoke, the louder the world outside seemed. Howls stretched across frozen plains, owl cries cut through still air, branches snapped like deliberate warnings. To those inside, the message was always the same: stay silent, stay small, let the spirits pass by. But silence itself wasn't always enough. Sometimes the hush had to be reinforced, shaped into ritual, turned into something more than discipline. Certain ceremonies required absolute stillness, no cough, no shuffle, no murmur. In those moments, silence wasn't camouflage. It was offering a gift to spirits demanding respect. And when silence became ritual, it needed structure. Families, tribes, whole communities rehearsed it together, bending sound into reverence. The hush of winter nights deepened into sacred stillness, shaping myths, ceremonies, and taboos that lasted far longer than the cold itself. Silence wasn't only a habit of survival, it became a ritual in itself, a performance woven into the fabric of belief. The stillness of night wasn't treated as empty, it was treated as sacred, a space where every rustle or breath meant something. People learned not only to obey silence but to sanctify it, to transform restraint into ceremony. Many traditions marked thresholds with quiet. Before dawn, Hunt's families sat hushed, waiting for the first light, convinced that words spoken too early would startle animals or offend their spirits. In Siberia, hunters carried charms of bone and antler, but their most powerful tool was silence, the stillness that made them invisible to prey and respectful to unseen forces. Among the Inuit, silence before rituals was not optional but essential. Sound was thought to confuse the spirits, to muddy the dialogue between human and otherworld. The logic appeared in myths. Stories described spirits that fed on noise, beings who prowled the edges of camps waiting for a laugh or a cry to grant them entrance. Folklore in Northern Europe warned children that careless chatter at night would attract restless ancestors, their icy hands reaching for warmth. In the Americas, tales told of owls that listened for names spoken aloud, carrying them back to the realm of the dead. To keep silent wasn't just clever, it was cosmic insurance. Ceremonies themselves often required enforced stillness. In West African initiation rites, Silence was observed for days. Young initiates forbidden to speak, lest spirits overhear and test them. Monastic traditions across Eurasia echoed the same ideas centuries later. Silence as a form of discipline, proof of humility, a door left open only to the divine. Though contexts shifted, the principle remained the same: sound was power, and withholding it was an offering. Ritual silence also structured community life. Large gatherings often opened with pauses, moments where no one spoke, as if waiting for the spirit's approval. Ethnographic records describe entire nights passed in collective hush before major events: marriages, hunts, funerals. Silence used as a cleansing force, a reset of balance. In these contexts, sound wasn't absent but delayed, released only at the right moment, giving it greater weight when it returned. Even gestures took on ritual meaning. A hand-raised palm outward in stillness was thought to repel spirits. A bowed head during silence wasn't only humility, it was a signal of alignment with cosmic order. Archaeological finds of carved figurines in postures of quiet hands clasped, mouths closed, may reflect this reverence for stillness. Statues as reminders of what discipline demanded, and myths warned of the cost of failure. The child who cried too loudly might be taken. The hunter who spoke before dawn might return empty. The widow who wailed without restraint might invite further death into the household. Silence was framed not only as discipline but as law, enforced by both predators and spirits. Its breach punished swiftly, but silence, like all laws, needed training. Children weren't born quiet, and families spent countless nights teaching them to master restraint, which meant that silence was never only a ritual for adults, it was drilled into the young, rehearsed generation after generation, until quiet itself became an inheritance. Children were the most unpredictable part of the night heap. Their small lungs didn't understand discipline. Their cries pierced walls like knives. Yet silence was non-negotiable, and so entire systems of care grew around teaching the young to live quietly. It was training as much as tenderness, an education in hush that began almost at birth. Infants were kept in fur-lined slings, pressed directly to their mother's skin. Warmth soothed, milk muffled cries, and the steady rhythm of heartbeat worked like a natural lullaby. Archaeological finds of moss-stuffed wrappings confirm how carefully moisture and comfort were managed. Every detail designed to reduce restlessness. Mothers hushed babies, not with loud coos, but with vibrations felt more than heard. Songs turned into breath, whispers pressed into skin. As children grew, discipline hardened. A cry wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Parents placed hands over mouths, tapped lips, whispered warnings of spirits listening outside. Silence was framed as both safety and morality. In Inuit accounts, children were told that noisy play at night could summon polar bears. In Siberia, they were warned that ancestors would be angered by careless chatter. Fear sharpened obedience faster than affection ever could. Games helped, too. Ethnographic records describe children competing to stay silent longest, rewarded for restraint. Whisper games trained voices into softer tones, and gesture games replaced noisy play with signals and mimicry. Even laughter was regulated, stifled into muffled giggles, sometimes redirected into storytelling so the hush wasn't broken. Childhood became apprenticeship in restraint, an early rehearsal of the silence that structured adult life. The stakes were visible. Archaeology offers blunt testimony. Infant graves clustered near winter camps, evidence of those too loud, too frail, or too unlucky to be saved. Survival wasn't merciful. Families invested every effort in teaching quiet because the cost of failure was too great. Every hushed cradle, every whispered song, every stern correction was an act of defense as much as love. Children absorbed more than silence, they absorbed the worldview that justified it. Spirits were listening, predators prowling, ancestors watching. The hush wasn't arbitrary, it was sacred. By the time they reached adolescence, silence was no longer a lesson but a reflex. Young hunters moved without words. Initiates endured rituals in stillness. Daughters whispered lullabies to siblings the same way mothers had whispered to them. Silence wasn't taught once. It was rehearsed nightly, carved into memory like soot into ceilings. And yet, despite all this training, noise still erupted. A child startled awake, a fit of coughing, a burst of laughter in dreams. When it happened, the response was immediate. Adults shifted, dogs stirred, fire hissed, and hands reached instinctively to smother sound. Panic was swift but practiced. In the hush that followed, everyone listened harder, waiting to see if the dark outside had heard. The training of children in silence reveals how discipline seeped into every layer of life. Noise was dangerous, not just because it was loud, but because it was uncontrolled, unpredictable. Children embodied that chaos, and so they were molded into silence early. And once the young were quiet, the hut itself could stay still, not only as a shelter, but as a rehearsal space for social order. Night silence didn't just protect against spirits, it taught how to live together without fracture. Silence didn't just keep predators out, it kept people in line. In huts where 20 bodies shared the same air, every cough and shuffle carried weight. Noise wasn't merely disruptive, it was insubordination, and so the discipline of quiet doubled as social glue, binding families into hierarchies that kept chaos at bay. The hush of night forced deference. Children hushed by parents, parents hushed by elders, everyone hushed by circumstance. In that stillness, power became audible, not through speech, but through who was allowed to break it. Elders could whisper a story. A hunter might murmur instructions before dawn. But idle chatter from anyone else was quickly silenced. Quiet created ranks, with speech as privilege instead of right. Archaeologists see its imprint in the architecture of sleeping spaces. The hearth at the center, women and children packed tight nearby, men along the edges, elders often elevated or shielded. The geometry of warmth was also the geometry of authority, everyone learning their place in the hush. Noise wasn't just discouraged, it was disciplined into submission. Ethnographic accounts underline the point. In Arctic camps, silence after dusk was described as law, with breaches punished by sharp gestures or even ritual reprimand. In West African villages, elders enforced hush as a form of moral order, linking noise to arrogance, selfishness, or disrespect for ancestors. Across the Americas, night silence was equated with communal strength, while talkativeness was mocked as weakness or danger. The rule was clear. To be loud was to betray the group, and silence did more than suppress conflict, it absorbed it. Arguments that might have erupted into shouting matches were swallowed into glances, into stares heavy enough to wound. Resentment was stored in the body, carried forward to daylight, where it could be released in more controlled settings. Night demanded cooperation. Even anger had to be muted, disguised as discipline. The result was a paradox. Silence was communal, but it was also coercive. It smoothed edges, prevented fractures, but it also taught submission. Children grew into adults who knew how to obey the hush. The discipline of quiet shaped not only survival but character. Those who could endure it were considered strong. Those who cracked under it were seen as liabilities, unfit for leadership or responsibility. Spiritual belief reinforced this social control. Spirits were said to listen, but so did neighbors. To break silence was not only to risk supernatural punishment, it was to invite judgment from the living. A careless word at night could be remembered, repeated, exaggerated. In this way, the hush became surveillance. Everyone listened, no one spoke, and reputations were carved in stillness. But silence wasn't endless. Dawn broke it. As fire smoke thinned and light returned, voices rose cautiously, first in whispers, then in chatter, finally in song. The contrast reinforced its power. Night was order, discipline, deference. Day was release, noise, negotiation. By repeating this rhythm, silence etched itself deeper into cultural identity, a ritual of control rehearsed nightly. And when the thaw came, when huts opened and people spilled into open air, the hush didn't vanish. It followed into ritual, into ceremony, into the very definition of respect. Silence, once a tool of survival, hardened into tradition, repeated through seasons, remembered in myths, and echoed even in later religions that turned quiet into prayer. Silence didn't end with the season. It was stitched into memory, carried forward long after snow melted and huts were abandoned for open air. What began as survival became continuity, a ritual repeated across generations until it shaped entire worldviews. Quiet wasn't simply a response to winter, it became a cultural inheritance, a discipline preserved and transformed. Archaeology hints at this continuity in the soot-blackened rafters of dwellings, the wear of hearthstones that burned day and night, the clustered burials of those who hadn't survived their training in silence. Ethnographic records show the same practices echoing across time: whispered lullabies, hush before hunts, communal quiet during rituals. What began as practical defense hardened into tradition, passed from parent to child as unquestioned truth. Seasonal cycles reinforced the lesson. Each winter demanded silence again. Each thaw allowed voices to return. This rhythm carved itself into expectation. Quiet nights, noisy days, silence in scarcity, sound in abundance. Even in places where climates softened, the memory lingered. Myths carried it forward, warning against careless words, praising restraint. Silence transformed into ceremony. Monastic orders across Eurasia inherited the logic, sanctifying hush as discipline, treating speech as privilege. Night vigils, prayers in stillness, rituals of fasting without words, all these echo the older rhythm of survival silence. In the Americas, ceremonial dances opened with hushed pauses, stillness offered before the eruption of song. In Africa, initiation rites demanded days of quiet, silence as proof of readiness. The lesson was the same everywhere. Speech is powerful because it is withheld. Even today, fragments remain. The hush in churches, the moment of silence before games, the quiet kept around the dying, all of it draws from the same well. Silence protects, dignifies, marks thresholds. It turns absence into offering. What once shielded families from predators and spirits now shields communities from chaos, giving shape to memory and reverence. But continuity never means perfection. Silence can control as much as it protects, suppress as much as it sanctifies. In crowded huts, it prevented conflict but also stifled expression. In rituals, it reinforced hierarchy, distinguishing those who could command it from those forced to obey it. Silence has always been double-edged, a tool of safety and of discipline, of intimacy and of power. The transformation of night hush into cultural law shows how necessity becomes belief, and how belief endures long after its practical roots fade. The cold that once carried sound too far no longer dictates survival for most communities, but the ritual it forged remains embedded. Stillness, once camouflage, is now reverence. Quiet, once demanded by wolves, is now demanded by gods. And so the rituals of night silence lived on, reshaped but never erased. They carried people through winters, through hunger, through fear of both animals and spirits. They trained children, enforced hierarchies, bound families together. And even when huts collapsed and bones sank into earth, silence itself endured as discipline, as ritual, as memory whispered into the long night.